Over and again, the Bible reminds us that our story did not begin in dramatic tales of heroism or wars of independence. Our story begins in 430 years of slavery. Once you were slaves in Egypt, but the Lord God brought you out. Therefore, I will be your God and you shall be my people. The important thing about these stories is not history or geography. These stories are interested in theology, the meaning of this story for the faith of Israel, and therefore its meaning for all generations of God's people, including our own. The stories are intended to introduce us to God's deliverance, God's salvation, and the possibilities for new life when we trust in God's deliverance. Here are some of the lessons of faith to learn from the stories of Exodus. Number one, these stories teach us that God's grace is always at work in our midst, making life possible even when circumstances seem hopeless and we wonder if God has forgotten us. In the death-dealing circumstances of genocidal bondage, God does not intervene in some thunderous act of divine providence. Instead, God's grace plays itself out through 5 relatively anonymous women, Shiphrah and Puah, the midwives of Israel, who defy the Pharaoh's orders to kill all male children at birth. The mother and the sister of Moses, who save him from the Pharaoh's order. But finally, the Pharaoh's own daughter, a princess, takes Moses in as her own in defiance of her father's orders. God remembers those in distress, and Exodus is a story that reveals to us who God is and how God enlists us into the divine work of deliverance. Exodus 3 is the story of Moses' encounter with God in the burning bush. This is the God of the ancestors, the God who remembers us. Before we have any story to remember, God remembers. And in Exodus 3, verse 7, what I think is one of the most important verses in the entire Old Testament, we learn some new things about God in the biblical story. Let me read that verse for you. Then the Lord said, I have seen the affliction of my people. I have heard their cries because of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them. A brief verse, maybe even a familiar one, but in the 4 verbs of this verse, we learn an enormous new portrait of what God is and what God does in the salvation story. First of all, God sees and hears, and what God sees and hears are affliction and cries of pain, not cries of prayer. They don't even know the name of God to pray to. They simply cry out and God hears and God sees. But the third verb may be the most revolutionary here. It says God knows their suffering. Now, in biblical Hebrew, the verb to know is broader in meaning than our ordinary verb to know. It does not mean cognition, that knowledge in the head that we generally think of when we talk about knowing. In Hebrew, to know is to experience what is known. So it's actually saying that God participates in our suffering. God knows our suffering. God experiences our suffering with us. And this is the beginning of a theme in the story of God's salvation that ends in the cross when God in Jesus Christ fully knows the pain of human suffering. The fourth verb, God doesn't just settle for sharing our experience of suffering. God has come down to deliver, to open a path to the future, to make a difference possible, to make life possible where only death seemed possible. But God does enlist Moses and us as leaders. God enlists human partners in the divine work of deliverance and salvation. God says, I've always thought this was a little bit humorous. God says, I have come down to deliver you, but you, Moses, shall go to the Pharaoh. And Moses tries to object. He actually objects 5 times, including he says he doesn't even know God's name. But God patiently equips him, says, well, I'll reveal my name to you, the divine name Yahweh, rooted in the verb to be. God is the source of our very being, and this is the God who goes with Moses. And Moses finally accepts his challenge and goes to confront the Pharaoh. But a third thing we learn about the Exodus story is that it's a salvation story. And that may seem obvious. There are actually 2 Hebrew verbs that mean to save or deliver or to liberate, and they appear frequently throughout the entire first 15 chapters of Exodus. But we need to be clear. Salvation and these 2 verbs do not mean salvation in some spiritual sense of establishing relationship with God. These people are slaves suffering from the hands of a political tyrant. And so salvation is God's work to make our lives whole, whether that's physically whole in a situation of bondage or spiritually whole in the relationship of God to Hebrews as the people Israel, God's covenant partner. There is a physical and a spiritual dimension to salvation and must be in our own work to share in God's work of salvation. Deliverance is political and cultural freedom to be who God created the Hebrews to be. The work of salvation is both political and spiritual for us if we know and serve that God. And deliverance involves challenge and difficulty. There are moments of doubt when the people turn on Moses and say, wasn't there enough death in Egypt that you brought us out here in the wilderness to die? It teaches us that the new life in God's deliverance is not straight into the promised land. It's into a wilderness with its challenges and its testing. And the great climactic moment comes in 2 stages in this story. First, the Passover, the night when death comes to the powers of tyranny. This is a story told from the underside, from the dispossessed, from those suffering from tyranny. And it teaches that in God there are powers equal even to the greatest earthly powers that oppress. God passes over the faithful, but exacts a terrible price for the tyrant. And this occasion is celebrated to this very day by the Jewish community and the celebration of Passover, but it's celebrated by us as Christians in the Eucharist, where we remember Jesus' death as the Passover sacrifice that makes new life possible. The great climactic moment after Passover comes when the people are set free by the Pharaoh, but find themselves with the sea in front of them and a Pharaoh who has changed his mind and is pursuing them to kill them. It looks like death is the only possibility up against the edge of the sea. This is that moment when we are reminded that sin and tyranny always continue to challenge us. But it's a story that reminds us that God always provides a way into the future, even through the improbable heart of the sea. And it's out of this remarkable deliverance story, even through the sea, a final thing we must learn from this Exodus story is that the story gives rise to a pattern at the heart of faith experience that continues to be at the heart of faith experience by God's people in all generation. This is not just a story of ancient times, but becomes the story of every generation, even our own. It's a pattern that begins with situations of despair. We all have our ways of coming up to the edge of the sea, those times when we can see no way into the future, where we feel like death and hopelessness and grief have grasped us, and there is no way that we can go forward. And in those situations of distress, we cry out. We express our despair and our grief, our pain. But in this pattern of Exodus faith, unexpected deliverance always opens up away from God into a future, not always the one we expected or wanted, but a path into the future from that moment. And when we receive that gift of unexpected deliverance, the proper response is thanksgiving and praise. And Moses and Miriam dance and sing on the other side of the sea in Exodus 15. It's very important to understand that knowing of this pattern of God's salvation, God's deliverance, doesn't mean that people of faith always get what they wish for in those moments of crisis, those moments up against the sea. Often, God's way into the future comes in unexpected ways. This can be both personal and corporate. I can share with you a very personal story that I clearly, in my own experience, was up against the edge of the sea, feeling enclosed by forces of grief and hopelessness, when my first daughter, at the age of 3 years old, died of leukemia. I thought the world had ended. But I had to learn in that moment, and I was helped in that moment by being surrounded by a community of faith witnesses. I was helped to give thanks for her life, even as brief as it was. She died at the age of 3. I had to learn that her life was more important than her death, and that my life and its continuing possibilities was more important than that moment of death. That moment will always remain an offense. It's in the same way that for Christians, the cross always remains an offense, and we can't forget it. But the resurrection lies beyond. The path through the sea lies beyond. That's what God's grace is all about. The moments of unexpected deliverance, the resurrection that comes after the cross. We can trust that God will open ways into the future, even from the most difficult moments. The people must journey on to Sinai. That's the next section of Exodus, because they must do the hard work of becoming God's covenant community, a community that can witness to this salvation story and the way in which it continues for every generation. This pattern of faith is reflected in the gospel story. The cross is that moment of despair which even Christ experiences. My God, why have you forsaken me? What could be more unexpected than a resurrection, a new life out of death? But Pentecost must follow to form a community to witness to that. On to Sinai. That's what lies beyond Exodus.